Hey, peace and blessings, and have I got something to show you today? If you're from Australia, and particularly if you're from Melbourne or Sydney, you're gonna want to stick around and stay to the end of this video because a couple years ago, I found something very, very interesting. Right now, you probably can't see it, properly behind me, but I'm gonna zoom in a couple minutes and show you what I've got here. But I do have to say, right? Let's jump back, all the way back to the scamdemic that happened a couple of years ago, right? And it makes you beg the question: out of all these places in the world, right? Why were all eyes, right? All eyes were on Melbourne. Now, of course, the lockdowns occurred in Melbourne. Yeah, of course we know that. And Melbourne was basically the epicenter for COVID, right? Melbourne was the testing ground for COVID. Melbourne, everybody all across the world was looking at Melbourne, right? You had like news coverages from all across the world. Everybody was zoomed in, focusing in on Melbourne, right? And so it makes you beg the question, why was everybody looking at Melbourne? Right? Why do all these psychological operations always happen in Melbourne? Why do all these psychological operations happen in Sydney? Why do all these things take place in Melbourne? Is it because Melbourne has, the biggest population here in Australia? Well, that can't be true, right? We know that, New South Wales has the largest population in Australia. Is it because, Dan Andrews, he was a corrupt politician back then? Well, maybe. Maybe that has something to do with it. But, personally, I don't think that that's really the case. If that was truly the case, that means that he would have to be a sole dictator operating on his own. And we understand that, the world doesn't really operate like that. The world has a system in which it adheres to, right? A pyramidical structure. And on that structure, that power structure, you have pawns and puppets who play their role on that, pyramidical paradigm that we see, right? So we see, people, playing their part, but can you say that these people are solely responsible? I don't think so. That's not how it works, right? And, something else is very interesting. Why do we always see psychological operations occurring in Melbourne and Sydney, right? Why do we see all these things happening in Melbourne and Sydney? And what I'm speaking about right now, I want you to tie that in to the events that are taking place right now out, especially in Australia. What type of events do we see? These crimes that are being committed, right? We see these crimes that are being committed and forgive me for, thinking here, but my brain is telling me, here we go again, right? Here we go again. Problem, reaction, solution, right? We see a problem occurring and then we see a reaction from the public, right? We see these things taking place and we see everybody's being shocked, right? And then what we need to do, we need to enforce certain laws now because the public, well, they're getting outraged. The politicians are very angry and upset. Now, am I saying these things didn't happen? Not at all. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, all I'm saying is, and what I'm pointing out to is a simple method called Hegelian dialectic, right? You follow these things, you cannot go wrong. You can see the forest for the trees. You can see these things happening a mile away, right? It's just the problem is that they don't want you to think about these things, right? Because if you think about these things, you're going to be one step ahead of them. And if you're one step ahead of them, well, they can't manipulate you. They can't enforce their agendas on you, right? So what psychological operations are always seeming to take place in Melbourne? What psychological operations are always seeming to take place in Sydney? Well, let me show you something today. And I stumbled upon this map 2 years ago. Actually, it might have been even longer. And I'll have to do my due diligence and apologize right now because I didn't get this information out any earlier. And, unfortunately, I don't really see many other people talking about this map. But here behind me is a map. And this map is called the 100 Rockefeller Resilient Cities. That's right, 100 resilient cities across the world. And these resilient cities, well, they were formed in 2013 by the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, the initiative here is to support cities in developing strategies to increase their resilience to shocks and stresses, right? Well, look at that. Melbourne is Wave 1 Rockefeller Resilient City. And not far behind Melbourne, we also have Sydney here, right on the right hand side. Now, Sydney is a wave 2 Rockefeller Resilient City. Now, doesn't this just explain a lot? Doesn't this just explain, all the questions that we have as to why Melbourne and Sydney at the... No, it's got nothing to do with populace. Yes, they must obviously be the, largely populated cities in Australia. But nonetheless, you have to understand these two places here are Rockefeller Resilient Cities, with Melbourne being the first, Melbourne being the testing ground for the New World Order. That's why you see everything you saw happen the past couple of years. That's why if you live in Melbourne, right, you now have to be aware that you live in a wave 1 Rockefeller Resilient City, meaning a lot of the shocks, a lot of the, psyops, a lot of these things that are taking place, well, they're going to be waged against you if you live in Melbourne. You're going to see a lot of these things waged against you if you live in Sydney, right? So just be prepared, and please send this video to anybody who, lives in Melbourne and Sydney, and let them know. Show them this map. Download this map for yourself and check out this map. And, it's going to make a lot more sense once you actually internalize these things, right? And when I say Rockefellers, well, of course I'm talking about the Rockefellers that created the Operation Lockstep guide and manual. And, that guide and manual, you're going to want to check out Operation Lockstep and give it a good read. Once you give that manual a good read, you're going to see, all these strategies that they're trying to implement on us, right? And manipulate us with and enforce us with. They can't do that unless they have these crises happening. They can't do that unless these scenarios are taking place, right? And so they can't enforce these agendas unless they have a lockstep in place, meaning something happens, right? They come up with a strategy, and implement certain agendas for these strategies, to be locked into, right? So once these strategies are in place, then they, time goes by. Then they move in with the next strategy, right? Time goes by. Things get worse, right? And if you come from somewhere like a communist country, right, you see what happened with the whole Bolshevik revolution, back going years and years and years ago, right? You will see how slowly these things operated over time, right? They just didn't happen overnight. They implemented a strategy. Well, I want you to do some homework. Go and read the Operation Lockstep manual, which was created by the Rockefellers, and it's going to blow your mind. You're going to see truly how far we are, once we read this manual, how far we're actually, in the game right now. None of this is a conspiracy theory. This is all fact, right? Anybody who thinks this stuff is a conspiracy theory, well, they're suffering from cognitive dissonance, right? They're suffering from cognitive dissonance, and, you can only do so much. You can only plant the seed, right? So go and check these things out. All right, as always, much love, stay blessed, and stay prayed up out there.